And good morning. How's everybody doing? Welcome to class today. It is Tuesday, February the 21st, and we are now in week 7 of this class. Don't forget, after week 8, which is next week, we have our second exam coming up. So we've got a lot going on. We've got discussion boards and homework this week, and then preparing for exam 2 next week. And exam 2 will look exactly like exam 1. All right. So this week we're doing chapter 7. Now there is one change for next week, and I'm going to be talking about it again next week. We are not doing chapter 8. We are skipping over chapter 8, and for week 8 we will do chapter 9. And then for the rest of the semester, we will be one chapter. Our chapter will always be 1 week ahead of our week. So we'll be doing in week 8, we'll be doing chapter 9. In week uh, 9, we'll be doing chapter 10. In week 10, we'll be doing chapter 11. So we're going to be ahead. So starting next week, we're going to jump over week 8 and we're going to go to week 9 next week. Hope somebody listened to this video and knows that. Let's see, do we have any viewers here? Yeah, we do have one viewer here today. Fantastic. Okay, cool. So that's what we're going to be doing. Let's go ahead and get started, shall we, on chapter 7, social thinking and influence. Hold on, let me turn my light on here. Get myself a little bit of light. It helps me out. Okay, so we're going to be talking about chapter 7, social thinking and social influence. We're talking about social psychology, how people function in groups. And you know what? This is my specialty. So this week we're going to be talking about social psychologists and what they do. Okay? The learning objectives. What we're going to do is talk a little bit about snap judgments and systematic judgments. And we're going to talk about the fact that human beings try to be efficient and do as much automatically as they possibly can, and that affects the way we perceive other people. Uh, we're going to talk about some of the shortcuts that people use when they make attributions about other people. We'll talk about what attributions are. And then we're going to talk a little bit about how people influence our behavior, the difference between normal and informational influence. And we're going to talk about a couple of very, very famous studies on influence and conformity, one by Solomon Asch and one by Stanley Milgram. And then we're going to talk about some of the strategies that people use to try and gain your compliance. If you become aware of these strategies, hopefully you can protect yourself from being a compliance victim, from having somebody get you to do something you really don't want to do. Let's go ahead and get started, shall we? Okay, so I'm a social psychologist. The subfield that would be interested in what we're talking about this week is called social psychology. Social psychologists are interested in how people function in groups. How does the real or imagined presence of others affect the way we think, feel, and behave? So, we're going to talk about how we think about other people in the first part of this chapter, and then we're going to talk about how groups of people and individuals affect our behavior. So we're talking about social psychology this week. Know that because there's actually a question on your homework about this subfield. So this week's chapter is about social psychology. Now, one of the things that human beings do is they look around and try to figure out other people. We all do that every day. We sit around and think about what other people's behaviors mean for them and their personality. So we engage in what's known as person perception, the process of forming an impression of another person. So, who am I? Over the course of 7 weeks, you probably got an idea of who my personality is. So you've developed a perception of me, as I have done of you as well. And we look at lots of different things when forming an impression. We may look at a person's appearance, their behavior, how they act, We may look at their nonverbal behavior, and we may look at the situational cues in the environment to sort of detract from their personality. Well, that wasn't really Chris, that was more of the situation. So, when we're trying to figure out and form an impression of what a person is like, we use lots of different things, lots of different pieces of information. Now, I might ask you, why do we need to have person perceptions? Why are human beings interested in figuring out what other people are like? Well, we do this because it makes the world more predictable. If I know how Bob acts, I know what to expect when I'm around Bob. Same thing with Tina. Tina acts differently, and so I expect different things when I'm around Tina. Knowing how other people are going to respond allows us to adjust our behavior to have smoother interactions. So, human beings are very, very interested in developing perceptions of other people. Now, what you're going to find, and I think we talked about this with stress the other day. Human beings sort of engage in two basic kinds of processes: automatic processes and quick processes, or automatic processes and more thoughtful processes. Human beings process information thoughtfully, and they also process it uh, quickly and automatically. Human beings do that. Now, the thing is, human beings, as much as possible, try to do as much automatic processing as they possibly can because we have just a limited amount of attention. You ever notice you can only pay attention to so many things at a time? We can only really focus and really thoughtfully think about a few things. So, human beings try to do as much of their thinking with automatic snap judgments if possible. And so we do the same thing with person perception. I might see you and look at your t shirt and come to a quick judgment about your entire personality just based upon one thing you say, or a t shirt you're wearing, or an action that you engage in. That's what we might call a snap judgment about a person. Okay, and we do that in person perception. And then the other way that we form impressions that we may sit and get to learn a person over time and interactions and form a very thorough, controlled, and effortful um, sort of belief and perception of who that person is. Now, as I tell you at the bottom of this in blue, humans are cognitive misers. We have as little, we don't have a ton of attention actually in this space of cognitive psychology. It's known that your ability to pay attention and really to think about things thoroughly is limited. You can only do one math problem at a time. You know what I mean? You have limited consciousness. So human beings try to do as much as they possibly can automatically, reflexively. I learned that this strategy works in most situations, and then when I meet something that makes me think of that situation, I go to that automatic reflexive behavior. That allows me to save my little bit of attention for other things that are really new uh, and need my attention. All right. So human beings sort of engage in what we might call automatic thought processes and controlled thought processes. We're actually going to demonstrate this Thursday night in class when we talk about we're going to take the IAT, the oh my goodness, the IAT. I forget what the heck that means. The IAT test. Hold on, IAT test. The what in the world? The implicit association test. And we're going to find out if you have any implicit beliefs that you're not aware of. And you're going to be surprised at the implicit biases you have towards other groups. So we're going to talk about the automatic and controlled processes. I do want you to know that for the homework and for the exam. The fact that human beings, we are thoughtful sometimes and we are reflexive and not thoughtful other times. And it's simply a function of the limitations of our ability to pay attention. Okay, so now when we form impressions of other people, we have sort of uh, uh, things that we do that help us to move along more efficiently and quickly. All right, so human beings love to process information uh, quickly. And when we perceive other people, we try to engage in person perception just as quickly and just as efficiently. Now, some of the ways in which human beings shortcut this thoughtful process are right here. I've got two of them, or actually one, two, three, probably four, five, four different examples of ways in which people shortcut the impression formation process. Now, I'm sure your mom always told you when you were a little kid, make sure you're polite because first impressions matter. Now, maybe your mom said that and you didn't really understand what she meant, but the crazy thing is, there is this primacy effect. We tend to weight the first things we see a person do when forming an impression of them. This is called the primacy effect. So you can be the most polite person ever, but if the first thing that I see you do is impolite, what I'm going to do is I'm going to use that information to form my initial impression. And what you're going to find is that it's hard for people to change impressions once they have one of you. This is called the primacy effect. Now, one reason which we may have this primacy effect is because of what's known as the confirmation bias. People can also be selective in how they perceive and process information when forming an impression. So, when I look at you and your behavior, I'm sure Iris, you're sitting out there right now in the audience. Iris, when I look at you, I can look at any number of things that you're doing, wearing, thinking, or feeling. What information should I choose to focus on? Well, the weird thing with impression formation is people engage in what's known as the confirmation bias. Once I think that you're a rude person, I begin looking and paying attention to those aspects of your behavior which might be considered rude, so I can confirm the initial perception that I have of you. And what I'm going to find myself doing is not paying attention to all the really polite and nice things that Iris does. Instead, I'm going to pay attention to just those situations that will confirm my initial opinion that Iris was a rude person because I saw her say something mean on the telephone, right? So we engage in sort of this confirmation bias, if you will. Now, you know, the crazy thing about uh, about our perceptions of other people is our perceptions can actually affect them. That's why I think impression formation is really important because our beliefs in a person can actually cause that person's behavior to change in subtle ways. Now, this is called the self-fulfilling prophecy. Now, they did this really cool experiment way back in the 60s where they gave graduate students rats. And in the learning in the 50s and 60s, a lot of the research was teaching rats how to run mazes and what kinds of things affected rats' ability to run mazes. It was a brand of psychology they called behaviorism. So there used to be a lot of studies where people had to teach rats how to navigate mazes. Well, in this 1960s study, they took these rats and gave them to different grad students, and they told these graduate students a lie. Half of the students, they said, your rats have been genetically bred to be intellectually superior. We know that your rats are going to learn where the cheese is in this maze really quick. They told the other half of the grad students that each had a rat, they said, okay, you're going to be training your rats. However, these rats have been uh, raised to genetically to be poor maze learners. They've been genetically bred to have low levels of the skill that quality that we think is important for navigating these mazes. So they gave these rats that were all the same. They gave them to grad students, and they told them one of two lies. They set up expectations in these graduate students' head. They then had the graduate students train these rats. And the crazy thing is, the graduate students who had what they were told were smart rats, their rats learned the maze quicker than the grad students who had rats that were known as the May's dumb rats. Now, this finding was replicated not only in other animals, but it was also replicated in third grade children. One of the things that I think is really important as a teacher is that I form a positive impression of each and every one of you as an academic student. And so, what I try to do is to initially form a strong image of each of you as a student. I don't think about anything except how much of a student you are, because I know my behavior, subtle things that I may do, can affect your performance in this class. So this is why impressions are really, really important. And I've got sort of an example of how that self-fulfilling prophecy is. Now, we talked about snap judgments. We talked about maybe making judgments of people based upon on one criteria. I might look at your T-shirt and say that you're a drug user or a bum, or I might see your collared shirt and say, wow, that is a rich person right there. If you think about it, a stereotype is nothing but a snap judgment about a person based upon an easy to see physical characteristic, right? And it's a belief, a set of beliefs that are attached to one physical characteristic. Now, it's often based on physical characteristics. There can be stereotypes about maybe groups of people that don't necessarily look different, but really it's a lot of times based on things that are easy to see. And really, you're going to see sort of your biggest stereotypes are going to be based on race, skin color, gender, sex, which is a fairly obvious category to see, difference to see, and age, how old you are. And in fact, this week, if you'll come to my Thursday night webinar, when we take the IATs, I'm going to check your implicit beliefs about people of different color, people of different genders, and people of different age groups. We're going to see, and you're probably going to be surprised as to how impactful those beliefs are in you right now. They're operating under the surface. You're not aware of them, but I guarantee you, each and every one of you has these implicit stereotypes buried deep in your brain. We're going to find them out on Thursday night, okay? Now, one of the interesting stereotypes that you will see, and these stereotypes do have an effect. There's this interesting stereotype that you will see that plays itself out in court cases a lot. This has been demonstrated experimentally in court-like settings. It's called the "what is beautiful is good" stereotype. A lot of times, if a person looks good to us, we automatically assume all kinds of other positive qualities. Well, if that person looks good, they must be a nice person too. They must be smart too. They must have this or this or this. It turns out, it turns out that we tend to add positive qualities to people who look good. I can't tell you how many times on social media I've seen a really handsome star with a profound quote written underneath them, and you know that that person never said that quote. But because that person is attractive, we just sort of attach that smart saying to him. It's easy for us to believe that Johnny Depp said this deep, profound thing because he's so handsome to us, right? It's the "what is beautiful is good" stereotype. Now, as I mentioned, you'll see this happening in court cases. It turns out if you are attractive, you're more likely to be found innocent and you will receive less time. It turns out that being attractive helps you out in court with one with one exception. If the attractiveness is central to your ability to succeed, it turns around that being attractive actually works against you. So, an attractive person is likely to get less time for armed robbery. They're likely to get less time for shoplifting. But an attractive person uh, is likely to get more time for fraud or for a con or for sort of a con job, for using fraud to steal things, because their looks are sort of seen as helping that particular crime. So we have all of these sort of impression effects that happen. We quickly form impressions of people, and they're so hard to change. And they're hard to change because it turns out human beings look for things to confirm the initial belief because that's quick and that's efficient, right? And then a lot of times, but our beliefs, this is really important because our beliefs often cause people to behave in ways that confirm these beliefs. And as I wanted you to know, just understand that the word stereotype, we think of it sociologically as this bad, evil thing that reflects on morality. I would tell you that we all have stereotypes, and they're just general impression strategies that we use to quickly assess people. Now, forming impressions is a very important part of the social interaction process, and this is why it's interesting to social psychologists. Remember, for those of you who came late to class, what I do want you to know this week, and it's on your homework, uh, what we're talking about this week is called social psychology, the subfield of psychology that I'm in that's interested in how people are affected by the presence of others. Now, a second thing that we do as human beings, not only do we have impressions of people, but we assign causes to their behavior. You'll notice I have social in parentheses here because this is a social psychology chapter. We're talking about the causes that we attribute to other people's behavior. But human beings use attributions in all kinds of situations. In fact, when we were talking about stress last week, or a couple weeks ago, we were talking about people's attributions about the causes of things. So, an attribution is nothing more than a fancy way of saying what caused whatever happened. My attribution for my failure at that test, your attribution for your success at driving school. Okay, the attribution just is an explanation of why something happened. This week we're talking about social attributions, the causes that we place on other people and our behaviors. So, social attributions are inferences that people draw about the causes of their own and other people's behaviors. Now, and I have a little star there because, like I said, we're talking about social attributions. We are most likely to make attributions about other people's behavior when people behave in unexpected or negative ways, when events are personally relevant to us, or when we are suspicious about the other person's motives. Now, why do we make attributions? Attributions help us to further understand and react appropriately to our situation. The first step, again, is forming an impression. Are you a nice guy? Are you not a nice guy? The second thing is for me to figure out what do you want out of this situation? Why are you doing what you are doing? So making social attributions allows us to respond more effectively, and it really greases the wheels of social interaction. So making social attributions are very, very important. So we usually do them when people's behavior surprise us. As long as people are doing what they're doing, a lot of times we don't even think about the why. We only do it when people engage in behaviors that surprise us or engage in negative behaviors. We do it when people are engaging in behaviors that are close to our circle of importance, that are affect us, that are relevant to us. All right. And we do them when maybe we have sort of a negative impression of a person and we're not sure what they're doing. So sometimes we make attributions, sometimes we just go with the flow. So here's the deal. Let's look at an example. Let's say you and some friends go out for dinner, and while you're out there, the server is a little bit rude and friendly. They don't smile at you. They don't maybe say their name. They just walk up and go, "What do you want?" You know, kind of that. Let's say they're sort of rude, not over the top rude, but just curt and short and not very engaging. No smile and no nothing. As you and your friends are riding home from the restaurant, you discuss possible causes for the server's rude behavior. Doesn't really matter about a server, but the server behaved in an unexpected or negative way because you didn't really expect that out of a server. So during your discussion, what you're going to find is that your explanations about this server are going to fall into two general categories. And this is really the category difference that's important in in uh, in uh, in attributions. What we typically do is we will either say that the person's behavior is a result of their internal qualities. We'll make what's known as an internal attribution. Or what we'll do is we will say that their behavior was a result of something about this situation. We'll make an external attributions. They'll sometimes talk about internal or dispositional attributions. Disposition meaning part of you. And they'll talk about external or situational attributions. So you might see those words used with this. But an internal attribution is we just say that it's something about that person that made them do that. So we might say, riding home, wow, what a rude person that waiter is. And we might imagine that waiter being rude at home to their friends, rude at school, and just being a rude person. On the other hand, we might say that it was something about the situation. Now, typically, uh, uh, so we might say, wow, you know what? Maybe that waiter's just broke up with their boyfriend or girlfriend. That server just broke up with their boyfriend or girlfriend, and they're really hurting and sad tonight. Maybe that server had a family member that just died that day. Maybe somebody they really liked had gotten in a car accident. We might say, you know what? It's not that server's fault. I'll bet they were just having a bad day. That's what we'll call an external or a situational attribution. So when somebody does something important enough or salient enough for us to wonder why, we can either come to what's known as an external or an internal attribution about their behavior. Now, the reason I tell you that is because it's kind of interesting, is that most people have a very systematic pattern for making attributions about the causes of other people's behaviors. Now, I'm going to go back and revisit this idea of automatic and effortful because your book talks about that. What happens is when we see somebody engage in a behavior, since that person engages in the behavior, the automatic thing, the natural thing is to think about that person's as being as doing that because that's them. Because when you're looking at a person, you see them. They are the figure. Why did that person do that? Well, you're looking at them, they stand out to you. So that's the easy automatic thing to do. Now, what takes a little more time is for you to step back rationally and to see that person in a context, a situation. It takes a little bit effort to step back from the situation and say, wow, what's going on with this person that might affect their behavior? This requires effort and attention and cognitive resources. And what you're going to see in the little chart below is this two-step process. And what they're going to argue is that a lot of people don't have the time or the interest to engage in the effortful process. They instead engage in the first step, which is the dispositional or internal attribution, and then they don't adjust their evaluation of the person. We're going to talk about that on Thursday as well with person perception in the context of racism as well. So we're going to say that most people's judgment is dispositional or internal and a lot of times stereotype based, and then it requires effort for us to adjust for context or to adjust based upon our knowledge of our own stereotype. And they're going to argue that most people don't engage in this. Now, what does this mean for attributions? Well, what you're going to notice is that most people will engage in what's known as the fundamental attribution error. Almost all of us, all of the time, when we try to evaluate other people, we almost inevitably assign too much emphasis on their internal qualities and we don't pay attention to the environment's effect on a person's behavior. We are more likely to explain another person's behavior using an internal rather than an external attribution. Why was that waiter rude last night? That waiter is a rude person. Why did that student leave my class, my virtual class early? That is a rude student, right? Why did that teacher tell me that my paper was not very good and say it kind of rudely? You know what? That is just a rude teacher. We almost always put most of our emphasis on explaining a person's behavior as a result of their internal qualities. This is what's known as the fundamental attribution error. Now, the crazy thing is, you can think about this sort of as working as part of a larger bias that we have in general, known as the actor observer bias. Now, when you're looking at another person, they are the most obvious thing in your environment, and the situation is in the background. So we start with the person and make a dispositional, an internal attribution. And then our second step is to make that secondary judgment on the situation. We never get to that. So we tend to explain other people's behavior using internal attributions. However, when we're trying to explain our behavior, we don't see ourselves. The environment is the first thing we see. So we tend to judge our first attribution is that the environment is affecting our behavior. And then it takes us some thought to really say, you know what is it about me that affected my behavior? And so what you're going to find is most people tend to overestimate the effect of situation on their behavior rather than uh, their disposition. Okay, so if a waiter is rude, why is that waiter rude? Because that waiter is a rude person. If I get off the phone and my wife says you were rude to that student, I'll say, well, you know what? I'm just having a bad day. I'm tired. It's been a long day. I've had several students call me. I'm just tired of talking to students. See how I do that? Your behavior is a function of your personality. My behavior is a function of my environment. And when we move through the world, we tend to do that, underestimating the situation's effect on everybody else and overestimating the situation's effect on our behavior. If you think about it, it kind of makes sense. If it's the situation affecting people's behavior, then the world looks a lot less predictable. But if I know that Bob is rude, Tina's nice, Sandy's a pushover, Andy is really shy, if I know that, then it helps me feel like the world is more predictable. And attributions, to a certain extent, person perception and attributions are all about making ourselves feel comfortable, which leads me to the last bias that you see. Your book calls it a defensive attribution. I've seen it called the just world hypothesis. What happens is when we see bad things happen to other people, a lot of times we tend to focus on what they did, which could have caused that situation. Oh, my friend was mugged. Well, why was he walking down this street at night? Well, because he's allowed to walk down the street. We tend to do this a lot of times with victims of sexual assault. Well, if she hadn't worn that really tight dress, if she hadn't worn those clothes, if she hadn't been alone in that situation, dude, you are blaming the victim in this situation. And it turns out that we tend to do that. You know why we do that? Again, it protects us because if sexual assault is a fairly random event, it just happens. But if I can make sense of it by saying you caused it to happen to yourself, it actually gives me a little psychological protection. I don't want to think that crime in bad luck is random. I want to think that the world makes sense. Attributions are designed to help us make sense of the world. If bad things happen because we deserve them, and if people are predictable and I know that they're good or bad, then I can begin to build a world that sort of feels safe to me. So think about these attributional habits as ways of you trying to explain what's happening in a way that makes the world seem, if you will, to seem predictable. Does that make sense? Have I lost anybody yet? I haven't seen any comments in the chat bar in a while, and so I'm not sure if I'm making any sense. Timmy, good morning. It's good to see you. I saw you typed in the chat bar a little bit earlier. Okay. So hopefully you understand what I'm talking about. So social psychology, it's interested in how we form impressions of other people and form these stereotypical beliefs. And then social psychology is also interested in the biases and habits that we use to interpret other people in social situations. And that is what we're going to focus on Thursday night when we talk about our implicit biases in person perception. Now, uh, what we're going to talk about that really is we're going to be talking about this person perception in the context of prejudice this week. That's what we're going to be talking about. Now, I promise you, I am not going to preach. I don't want this week's lecture to come off as some sort of preachy thing. What I want to do is just to talk to you a little bit about maybe the underlying cognitive forces that drive us. Right? So there's lots of different ways to explain the causes of prejudice. You can go sociological, and you can say that some groups are have more resources and control the levers of power, and that's what causes them to treat other groups unfairly. You can take a moral, biblical stance and say that there's just evil in the world. What I'm going to do this week is take a cognitive, a psychological approach, and I'm going to argue to you that maybe prejudice is sort of built into a system, a cognitive system that tends towards simplicity of thought and and predictability. So what I'm going to argue is that maybe, in a sense, this differentiation that we have, this preference for our own groups, this sexism, racism, every ism we see, it might actually be built into the system of how we process information. Okay, so I'm going to talk about racism from a psychological point of view. Now, your book in chapter 7 is going to talk about two fundamental things as maybe being well, actually, what you're going to find is that a lot of your social cognition people are going to say that really you can trace it all back to how we think about the self and how we connect ourselves to the groups that we belong to. So look at these two theories up here, social categorization theory and social identity theory. Both of these theories are probably 60 to 70 years old. The first one by a fellow named by Tajfel and Turner, two guys, Tajfel and Turner, back in the 60s. And what they argue is that we like to break up the world into ones and zeros. We use cognitive category shortcuts to categorize people on the base of easily viewable group characteristics, right? Uh, if you look at that. We have brown people and we have tan people, or tan people and peach people. We have male people and we have female people. We have old people and we have similar people. If you think about it, you can categorize the world into lots of different ways. You can talk about state students versus Carolina students. We can talk about Southerners versus Northerners. We can talk about Americans versus Europeans. If you think about it, we can divide the world into tons of groups. Now, what we know is that human beings are really good at seeing group differentiations. People like to perceive the world in these groups, and the thing is, we like to put ourselves into these groups. So when we look at white, we might look at white and tan and brown people, and we might look and say, "Wow, I belong to the flesh the white group, and there are two other groups." So I am in this group, and those people are out of my group. I might walk around at a party and see males and females and go, wow, I see half of these people belong to me. They are in my in group, okay? And those other people over there, they're in an out group. And so human beings are very good at categorizing the world into groups and putting themselves into groups and knowing the difference between what we call an in group and an out group. Human beings love to categorize things. Number two, number two, our group that we belong, the groups that we belong to are actually a part of our identity. When you think of who you are, yourself, as I think of Chris Roddenberry, not only do I think of my individual qualities, I'm creative, I read, I wear cool hats, I'm short, I think of all these individual qualities, but when you ask me to describe myself, I'm also going to describe my group memberships too. Well, I'm a man. Well, I'm a Southerner. Well, I'm a Tar Heel fan because I went to Carolina. Well, I'm an American. You'll notice part of who you are is your group identification. Now, what we know is people are motivated to feel good about the self. We talked about self esteem a couple of weeks ago, right? Part of your self esteem is feeling good about your group too. So, if I am in the group of Caucasians, being a Caucasian, I want to like that group identity. That's a part of who I am. I am motivated to like that part. If I'm a male, if I if that is part of my identity, I want to feel good about males. Now, I want to feel good about being a Caucasian compared to people outside of my group. I want to feel good about being a male compared to people outside of my group. The weird thing is, people are motivated to feel good about their group identity because that's an important part of who they are. And if you go look in chapter 7, there's a little chart where they talk about how we have self esteem, which is our individual feel good about our individual self. And then we have a group esteem, which is feeling good about the group we're in. And the weird thing is, people are really good at bouncing from their group identity to their individual identity depending upon the feedback that they're getting. So if something personally bad happens to me as an individual, then I can just move myself and think of myself in terms of my group memberships and get away from that negative impact. I failed a test today. That's okay. I'm going to go home and watch the Carolina basketball game tonight and feel good about being a Carolina fan. So we use this group identity just like we use our individual identity to feel good about ourselves. So you got these two things. We categorize the world into groups we belong to and groups that we don't belong to. And the groups that we belong to need to be good because they're part of who we are. And they need to be good compared to people not in that group. So part of my feeling good as a human being is feeling good about my race compared to other races. Do you see what I'm saying? A little bit of preference. And what you're going to see is that these two things combined cause people to behave in predictable ways that begin to look an awful like prejudice or discrimination. Now, back in the 60s, this guy Tajfel and Turner. Uh, Actually, it was more Tajfel later. He was one with social identity theory. What he would do is he would bring people into the laboratory and he would put them into what he called the minimal group. He would put them in a room. He would have them make a decision. He'd give them like a pad full of dots and tell them to estimate the dots. And then he'd randomly put them into a group. Hey, you're a dot overestimator, or hey, you're a dot underestimator. And he would tell them that they had several people spread through the building that were in their group. And he would give them a chance to allocate money to their in group and their out group in different patterns. And what he found was people, if they thought they were in a group, even if they didn't know who the group was, why the group was, or who was in the group, he called it the minimal group. Just I put a label on you and said, you're a part of this group. You don't know why it is a group and you've never met any of the group members. he found that as soon as we put people into a group, they start showing favoritism towards in that in group. Now, we look at it and we say, holy cow, why are men doing this to women? Why are Americans doing this to Europeans or Africans? Why are Caucasians doing this to African Americans? And we build in all these sociological and moral reasons. But what Tajfel showed was as soon as you put people into a group, no matter how simple that group is, they're going to start showing favoritism. It's just a reflex behavior we have. Now, there's also a ton of research on what's known as the outgroup homogeneity effect. Have you ever heard people who sound like racists say, well, everybody from that group is all alike, or those people look all alike? Or you might hear one of your male friends say, you know what, all women are like this. Or you ladies might hear one of your friends say, you know, all men do this. When we make these sweeping generalizations, you might think of it as, wow, that's just not a nice person. But it turns out that we all engage in this type of behavior. It's known as the outgroup homogeneity effect. If you bring people into the lab and ask them to make judgments, they are always going to judge members of the outgroup as being more similar to one another than members of the in-group. So if you ask me, I would say yes, all women are basically the same. Men, oh man, men were completely different. You got guys like this and guys like this and guys like this. I'm basically demonstrating the outgroup homogeneity effect, okay? And each of you can pick your in group. Let's say if you're a minority, think about how you might judge an out group and how you probably use the same sweeping generalization about an out group that you don't use about your in group. Or if you're a female out there, think about some of the generalizations that you make about men that you say that women are not like. We all engage in what's known as the outgroup homogeneity effect. Now, here's the weird thing about stereotypes and categorizing people that's sort of part of the process. Each and every one of us is indoctrinated with beliefs about ourselves and others that are not necessarily to our making. Okay, so I'm a man, there are stereotypes about men, okay, that are a part of my identity. I didn't pick them, I don't want them, but these stereotypes, negative stereotypes, exist as part of my identity. If you're a minority student out there, there may be stereotypes about your group that maybe Caucasians made up, but you know those stereotypes. We, each and every one of us, know the stereotypes about our own groups. Some of these stereotypes are very, very negative. And when we're put into a situation where there's a stereotype about our group, it may affect the way we behave. Okay? And so if you look in your book, there's this research they show on minority students and IQ testing. And what they find is that you take the same test, okay, and give it to take an IQ test and give it to minorities and Caucasians, and have them take the test. Tell them it's an IQ test, and what you're going to find as a general rule is that your minorities are going to score about 10 points lower on average than your Caucasian students. Okay, and that is something that we talk about. That's common knowledge, and you can see and that's why they have preferential admissions in different schools, because we don't know exactly what these differences in these scores represent. Now, the weird thing is, you're going to see this difference between your Caucasian and your minority students. However, take the same IQ test, give it to the students, give it to a different set of Caucasian and minority students. But now, don't tell them it's an IQ test. Tell them it's a problem-solving creativity test. And what research has shown is that the difference kind of goes away. And so the belief here is that people's stereotypes that African Americans and Hispanics don't do as well in school. What they argue is that when you get into a school related situation, this stereotype vulnerability, this threat, kind of impacts your confidence and impacts your performance. So, stereotypes are just ways of categorizing and making sense of the world. They're shortcuts for impression formation. Oh, you're a female, you must be like this. Oh, you're from India, you must have these kind of qualities, right? Oh, people here, I'm from Alabama, in the southern part of the United States, they say, oh, you're from the deep south, you must have these kinds of beliefs. Stereotypes are a shortcut to the impression management process. And just like impression management can affect these biases, can affect how we process information about other people, it affects how we process information about the attributions we make for other people, why they do the things they do. Okay? We still have a few viewers. That's great. All right. Conformity. Oh, crap. I ran out of time again. Why do people conform? People conform for a lot of reasons. One of the things you can find in the world is that people engage in a lot of, you know what? I'm not even going to start this. What I'm going to do is I'm going to spend 15 minutes of lab on Thursday night, talking about these two studies. I want you to know the Solomon Asch line judging study and the Stanley Milgram shock learning study. What Solomon Asch found is that people, oops, sorry, I was cut off there for a minute. What Stanley Asch showed is that people will say something that they know is completely wrong in order to fit in with a group. Okay? And what Stanley Milgram found was that sometimes people will do really, really bad things if they're being told to by a person they think of as a legitimate authority. So these are situations where people's behavior can be changed by the force that other people place on them. We're going to talk a little bit about social influence. And then we'll talk a little bit about one of my former schoolmates, Robert Cialdini. He graduated from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. And this guy actually spent a couple of years working in sales rooms in different industries to find out how sales professionals used influence techniques to get people to buy products they didn't want to buy. And I'm going to suggest you buy this book by Robert Cialdini. Okay, I am so sorry for running out of time today. I wanted to get done with a little bit more. Hopefully we'll pick up this discussion Thursday night in webinar and we can talk about some really interesting things. If you don't have any questions, I'm going to go ahead and let you go. Take care, and I look forward to seeing you next Tuesday on YouTube. Bye.